Great. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining this session. Really sorry we're a few minutes late. Sadly, my co-host is having real problems with her mic. So she might join us later by telephone, but it means that we're going to miss a bit of her intro, which is a shame. But we'll just go straight on to the speakers in a minute. Just to remind you that obviously we encourage you to tweet along if you're finding anything particularly interesting. So the hashtag for the whole of the festival is #AutisticFestival. You can tag us in if you want, and that's @Autistica. So we're going to have a Q&A at the end of each of the two sessions today. So you can add in questions onto the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any point. And we'll sort out some of those questions for later on for the speakers. If you've got a speaker question specifically for one of our speakers, just put their name, then we know that we can direct that straight to them. Just a reminder that if you miss anything, don't worry. The whole presentation will be recorded, and we'll be sharing that on our YouTube channel possibly next week, I think. And yeah, so we are going to get started in a minute. Just to let you know who I am, I'm Head of Communications at Autistica. So that means that I sort of manage things like our website, our social media, our press coverage, and a lot of the information that we put out from Autistica. So really keen to work with great speakers like the ones we've got today to share the latest research with you all. So I think we're probably ready to get started in a minute for our first two speakers. So we've got Cara and Jade Norris, and the title of their talk is Improving the Wellbeing of Autistic Students Transitioning to University, the Problem-Solving Peer Support Network. So I think we all know that transition period, whether it's from primary school to secondary school or secondary to university, is a real challenging period for everyone, but especially for autistic children and adults. So it'll be really interesting to hear what they have to say. And then we've got another two speakers, and then we'll be having the Q&A, if we keep to time, at 11:05. So Cara and Jade are going to be speaking for 20 minutes. So I'm going to let them take over. So do you want to share your screen?
Okay, are we good?
We are good.
All right, so thank you so much to Autistica for having us along today to talk about our research. And thank you for everyone who's joined in to listen. So myself, I'm Jade Norris, and my colleague Cara Knight will discuss today some research that we've been doing at the University of Bath Centre for Applied Autism Research, looking at how to improve students' well-being, so autistic students' well-being when they transition to university, so in that crucial first year of university, using a new intervention called PROSPERS, so that's the Problem-Solving Peer Support Programme. I don't know how to move, oh, there we go. I think there might be a delay on moving slides, so hopefully that's worked. So, as most people will understand, transitioning to university is quite an exciting time. There's lots of new opportunities ahead, but it can also be challenging for the same reasons. So we know that students in general are far more stressed than perhaps they used to be a decade or two ago. And there are a lot more students now going to university who perhaps wouldn't have a few decades ago too. So there are a lot more students who come to university with mental health problems, for example. If we think about autistic students, that transition to university can be particularly difficult for many different reasons. So difficulties that autistic students in particular face are including with the academic work itself, having trouble with socialising, and also having difficulties with daily living, such as living in student halls, for example. And all of these factors affect students' well-being. Autistic students in particular can also have very limited social support when they get to university, and this leads to being more vulnerable to stress and anxiety in this group. And then ultimately, this can result in a disproportionately high dropout rate, unfortunately, for autistic university students. And this particularly happens in that crucial first year during the transition. As we know, and I'm sure you've heard in different talks, autistic people have a disproportionately high rate of mental health problems, such as, for example, depression and anxiety. In a typically developing sort of a university student group as a whole, those who have higher levels of autistic traits, so who have high traits but wouldn't necessarily get a diagnosis of autism, tend to report having lower quality social relationships and feeling more lonely at university. So we already know that there are specific issues for these students. So ultimately, students on the autism spectrum do require tailored support to help them with the transition to university. And I'm just going to hand over to Cara, and Cara, perhaps just went the slides on, okay?
Yeah, no problems. So, broadly speaking, we know that those who can't solve problems very well, it is a precursor to mental health problems, and those who can solve, those who have better problem solving skills often experience a better quality of life and improved well-being. So when thinking about managing problems, the way that we've understood it in this study and the way the literature sometimes explains it is by our orientation and style. So our orientation being our perspective or attitude towards a problem, so whether we approach it positively or negatively, and our problem solving style, so how we solve a problem, whether that's rational, avoidant or impulsive. And I think it's important to say here that we can always experience a variety of orientations and styles. We're not just one orientation and one style. It might be for different types of problems. So a more practical problem, we might be more positively orientated, but a more emotional problem, we might be more negatively orientated. Okay, so and we also know that problem-solving orientation is linked with poorer mental health, and that autistic adults and those with high autistic traits have difficulties with problem solving. And in the university population in particular, we know that problem solving is an important factor in the relationship between depression, anxiety, and autistic traits as well. So it brings us on to our peer support solving group. So there is other studies out there that have shown that problem solving intervention is effective for improving well-being and reducing mental health problems. And we also know that for autistic children, adolescents and adults, they can develop problem solving skills, including being able to consider others' perspectives in solutions. So we know that this is a viable target intervention for this group. So the current study, we wanted to test our problem-solving intervention on well-being, mood, and also problem-solving orientation, investigating the role of autistic traits. With recruitment, the main study is with typically developing students, but we also managed to recruit 6 autistic students. I suppose those who do the research in the area will know that trying to recruit autistic students before they've started university can be a little bit difficult. So yeah, we was quite pleased that we managed to get one group running. Okay, so the intervention itself. So once everyone had completed their first questionnaire, they were randomly allocated to either the intervention or the control group, so just experiencing the transition to university as normal. And from this, we got 6 non-autistic groups and 1 autistic group that I just mentioned there. And in the non-autistic groups, there was about 6 to 8 members in each. And each group met over 6 weeks in their first semester. We did have a break week, actually, so I suppose it was over 7 weeks for about 40 to 60 minutes. And for each group, there was 2 facilitators. It was usually me, Jade, or sometimes JD actually, who's talking later today. And one of us would be leading, kind of facilitating the conversation and generating more conversation. and one would be assisting with note-taking and being a support for students if any safeguarding or any other issues came up in the groups. The local Bristol Autism Support Service run a problem-solving group on more of a rolling programme and less structured, and they kind of gave us some advice and some training about what to expect in the groups and what's helpful in the groups. So that was also very helpful. So the intervention itself, the first couple of sessions were more about getting people relaxed into a group environment, feeling comfortable with sharing information, building that group rapport. So we had lots of discussion activities, mainly about problem-solving orientations and styles and relating that to ourselves, creating group rules, kind of thinking about confidentiality, just trying to make it a more safe environment for everyone. And then we also gave them some guidance on the problem-solving structure, which I will talk to you about now. So this was the bulk of the sessions. It was mainly about practicing this structure to approach problems in a different way. So the problem-solving structure is these 6 steps here, which I'll just briefly go through. So initially, it's about hopefully someone will volunteer and bring a problem, which some of the problems are up there. So struggling with deadlines, or you can't decide who to live with, or you've fallen out with friends. There can be anything, and we've made a big emphasis on whether it just feels like a small hindrance in life or it feels like it's taken over your whole life. Any problem can be brought to the group. So the problem presenter, the person who's presenting the problem, then has the opportunity to share kind of why and the obstacles of that problem. And they are given 6 uninterrupted minutes to do this. They don't have to use all the 6 minutes. All the timings are there for flexibility, but it just allows that person to have the time and space to talk if they need it, and also to keep us on task if we're deviating. So yeah, they just need to present their problem and then also their desired outcome, what they would like to achieve from bringing the problem today. And then the floor kind of opens to the group and everyone can clarify the problem by asking further questions. So these could be questions in relation to a solution that you're thinking of. Maybe you've got an idea, but you're not sure it would work because you need another piece of information. So yeah, the problem presenter can then answer all the questions. And then we move on to generating alternative solutions. The idea being here that the quantity leads to quality. So even if it's something unhelpful, so maybe if you're struggling with deadlines, if someone suggested, well, just ignore them, they'll go away. Probably not a very good solution, but it is a solution. And the idea being that we don't want to stop the creative flow. So just keep going and keep thinking of more and more solutions. And then it's about evaluating the solutions. So everyone can offer pros and cons to the solutions to the problem presenter. And once we've kind of had a discussion about that, the problem presenter can then pick the solutions that they feel comfortable putting into an action plan. Because obviously something that I might feel comfortable doing, someone else might. So if it's a conflict with friends, someone might say confrontation, but someone might think, oh, I just don't have the courage for that. So it's about picking an action plan that you feel you can put into place to reach your desired outcome. And then hopefully we get to check in with them the next week and everything's going great. But if not, there's an opportunity to replan and reformulate to see if there's any other solutions or ideas that we could implement.
Thank you, Cara. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight here the measures and some information about the participants that we used in the study. So as Cara mentioned, the participants got a questionnaire at the beginning of the study, so obviously before any intervention was given. And those measures are on the left here. And I repeated at 3 time points, so before the intervention, immediately after the intervention, and then a few weeks later to see what effects were sort of remaining a few weeks later. So we were obviously interested in the effect of autistic traits, and so we measured, we used the AQ for that, as most of these studies tend to do. We also had a scale measuring symptoms of social anxiety. And then in terms of well-being and mental health, we used the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. The PHQ measures depression symptoms, and then we have the GAD, which measures anxiety symptoms, and then we also had some 0 to 100 sort of visual scales of a few other factors that we were interested to. So for problem solving, we used the social problem solving inventory, which is basically a questionnaire that gauges your problem solving orientation and perhaps your use of certain problem solving styles as well, which Cara mentioned earlier. And then we also took a brief measure of non-verbal IQ, just to ensure that any group differences between the control and intervention groups were due to the intervention and not due to any sort of baseline differences in the groups. I won't go through all the information on the right, but just to say, if anyone has questions about it later, we've got that info there. But that is the demographic information for the non-autistic group there, just for reference. Okay, so we have a brief overview of the results here, and just to say that this study is still sort of ongoing and we're still analysing the data, so we just wanted to show you some results we thought would be important to sort of emphasise the potential utility of this intervention. So our main focus was well-being, so it was really nice to see that the intervention seems to have had an effect on well-being. So there's a general overall decrease in well-being, so poorer well-being, during basically the January exam period when you compare it to when students are going off for their Christmas break. So I think that makes sense. That was for all participants, and so perhaps it's just a general trend that you would expect. As you can see in the figure on the right, the intervention group seemed to have essentially like a buffering effect on well-being over time. So their well-being remains higher than that of the control group, which you can see in the bottom blue line at time 3. So it's kind of returns to baseline basically, whereas the control group's well-being just gradually declines over time. When it comes to the other measures, we had a similar effect on anxiety with this Christmas break exam period. So basically people were less anxious during the Christmas break compared to the January exam period, which is what we would expect. And all the other effects were non-significant. So we, as I mentioned, were also interested in investigating the role of autistic traits in this general student population, and also social anxiety on our outcomes. And obviously the outcome of interest here was well-being. So we ran a regression analysis, which I won't go into great detail about, but if anyone has questions, we're happy to answer them, to look at what factors predicted better well-being at time 2, so after the intervention, compared to time 1. And obviously, as you would expect, being in the intervention group was a significant predictor of better well-being, which mirrors the findings that I showed you earlier. And then higher IQ was also a factor. Crucially here, autistic traits and social anxiety were not significant predictors, but we are still analysing the data on this, and we are looking quite closely at the relationship between essentially higher levels of autistic traits and difficulties with the problem solving orientation, and that is showing some effects there, so that is still to come. Okay, so quite a bit of information here, but we, as the intervention is about the student experience, we wanted to highlight some qualitative information from some analysis we're doing to show how the participants experience the groups. So the blue bubbles are all non-autistic students from the larger study. The bottom one is a key quote from an autistic student, and then we've got some more from the autistic group specifically on the next slide. So I just wanted to read out a couple just to emphasize the change in these participants over time with the intervention. So the person in the top left bubble says that they now view problem solving as a positive activity rather than negative, that they enjoyed having a group of people to discuss issues with, and that they felt it was non-judgmental. And in the bottom right speech bubble, the person indicates that the groups have helped them to start approaching problems more rationally and with more of a bit of a plan to problem solving, and has made them feel like they take less impulsive problem solving decisions in their life. So these are really key sort of qualitative changes in the participants as a result of the intervention. And we like to highlight this bottom quote from an autistic student because it really highlights how applicable the intervention is in their real lives. So the student said that they think for one of their coursework submissions recently, they weren't able to solve one of the practice questions, and instead of what I normally do, which is half panic and then get upset that I can't remember, what the equations are, put it off for a while, I actually just stopped and thought, okay, there's got to be a better solution than panicking and skipping through your notes as fast as you can. Try and think more clearly, basically just slowing down your brain before it gets into panic mode, giving it more time to actually think of a solution. And we've got more examples of the autistic students' views. So if you remember from what Cara mentioned, we had a small group of 6 autistic students who had their own exclusive problem solving group on a weekly basis. So that it was just autistic students in that group. So the top left, before, if I had a problem and to solve the problem looked like it would require effort, I generally just try to avoid it until the very last possible moment. If I'm able to think of solutions more easily, then it's less effort to solve the problem, so I'm more likely to want to do it. In the top right, the person indicates a nice change from thinking of problem solving as a kind of abstract thing that you have to do in your life, and that they now think it's not anymore sort of this weird intangible thing, and that you can actually think about it in steps. Bottom left, the participant indicates that they feel that their problems are they know from sort of being in the groups that their problems aren't necessarily unique to them. And so if someone else has a similar problem, not only are the solutions helpful, but it's also nice to know that other people share the same problems as well. It's kind of reassuring. And then finally, this participant indicates that they like the exclusive autistic nature of this group. So it was helpful that everyone was autistic in the group, so it wasn't like you had to explain things. Like here they give an example of a sensory issue, not having to explain what the problems are. Everyone kind of gets what you mean. So these quotes just, I think, highlight nicely the effect of the intervention for the autistic group, for whom obviously it's quite difficult to do some statistical analyses for because we had such a small participant number. But this and our complementary qualitative analysis really show that they feel that the intervention was helpful to them. So for the main study, our conclusions so far are that the intervention of peer-supported problem solving appears to act as a kind of buffer that maintains well-being over the first semester and into semester 2 during the transition to university. If we're thinking about the utility for autistic students in particular, these kind of life skills problems with, sort of time management, sort of in the academic work side of things, in social situations, and so on. These problems can be particularly difficult for autistic people, particularly during this transition to a new period of life, possibly due to many factors, but including sort of generally less experience in having these problems and working to solve them. Obviously, the impact of the unpredictable social world, and also where some students would have previously had help from, for example, parents and carers in solving certain problems. And so Prospers, as we've detailed here, and hopefully can sort of detail a bit more in the questions, might be an effective support, particularly for autistic students during the transition to university. And I just wanted to highlight in the bottom right corner that for future research, we're particularly interested in this finding in the general population that there's a kind of interlinking relationship between problem-solving abilities, anxiety symptoms, and intolerance of uncertainty or difficulties with uncertain situations. And this obviously, as we know from the autism literature into anxiety and difficulties with uncertainty, would fit the literature on the autistic population specifically. And so I think this deserves a bit more attention. So finally, I just wanted to highlight that we have another study that we've just finished running, looking at doing Prospers online, essentially. So oddly enough, before COVID, we were planning on doing this study online anyway. So we were going to do it half in person, and then the next half, so the final 3 or 4 problem solving sessions would be done online through Discord. Discord is a gamer forum, essentially. So it just acts as like a chat forum. And we essentially did go ahead and do the problem solving groups just after lockdown happened. And as you can see from these quotes, this was really helpful to the students that took part. particularly during this kind of really difficult time for a lot of students. So I'm just going to read out some quotes to finish off. So this one participant says that they think the Prosper's intervention might have unconsciously influenced how I view group experiences. Previously, I may have been more likely to assume that other people don't share similar vulnerabilities or worries to myself, and so I'm more self-conscious about coming forward with certain experiences. When I'm in a space where the exchange of problems is actively encouraged, it helps me to see that other people have things weighing upon them too. And then finally, I think it made me feel connected to other human beings, which is of utmost importance right now, considering the isolation we're living in. It's so important for me to have frequent and meaningful connections with others. So that is an ongoing analysis that we're doing, and that's essentially the end of the talk. So thank you, and I look forward to the questions later.
Thank you both so much. Really interesting and great to see on Twitter. We've had a little bit of chat from people that went to university and found that transition really hard and feel that could have been really helpful to them. And gold star for keeping perfectly to time as well. Very impressed. Great. So we'll save the Q&A until after the next two speakers. So our next speaker is Clare Truman, who's going to be talking about the educational experiences of autistic children with and without extreme demand avoidance behaviours. So hi Clare.
Hi.
Do you want to give us your screen now?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, pressing the wrong button.
No worries.
Is that showing?
Yeah, that is showing.
Fantastic. So thank you very much to Autistica for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today, and thank you for listening. My name's Clare Truman. I'm studying for a PhD at UCL in London at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, or CRAE for short. And I'm supervised by Laura Crane, Patricia Howlin and Elizabeth Pellicano. And I'm here to talk to you about my first research study, which examined the educational experiences of autistic children with and without extreme demand avoidance behaviours. There is a term that's being used increasingly by clinicians and by other professionals, as well as by families, which is pathological demand avoidance. And that's used to describe a profile, which is sometimes considered to be an autistic profile, where children, young people and adults resist and avoid the ordinary demands of life. It was first discovered, if that's the right word to use, I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, by a clinical psychologist called Elizabeth Newson, and she wrote about it in 2003. There are many other features of pathological demand avoidance aside from this one, but this is often considered to be the dominant feature, so resisting and avoiding the ordinary demands of life. It's worth saying at the beginning that the use of the description pathological demand avoidance, or PDA for short, remains very controversial. So while this research focuses on the educational experiences of autistic children with and without extreme demand avoidance behaviours, we're not making a comment on the validity or the utility of PDA as a diagnosis. And I think that's just really important to state at the beginning. So we're looking at the educational experiences rather than whether PDA is a thing, because there's an ongoing debate about that. So the study itself, it was an online survey powered by SurveyMonkey, and we collected responses between January and June in 2017. We had 211 people respond, all of whom were parents or carers of school-aged autistic children in the UK. And the children ranged in age from 4 to 18. And then based on their responses to questions, we divided the participants into 3 groups. The first group, which was the autism group, was children and young people who had an autism diagnosis but didn't display any extreme demand avoidance behaviours. So didn't display behaviours associated with pathological demand avoidance, or didn't display them to the threshold where an investigation or consideration would be given to give a child a PDA diagnosis. The second group was the Autism EDA group, and this was a little bit confusing. This was children and young people who had an autism diagnosis again and did present with extreme demand avoidance behaviours, but hadn't been given a PDA diagnosis. And the final group was the Autism PDA group, who had an autism diagnosis and a PDA diagnosis. In order to put the children and young people into those three groups, we asked them questions that came from a survey called the EDAQ, the Extreme Demand Avoidance Questionnaire. That's a survey developed by O'Nyans and her colleagues in 2014, and it asks questions about the features of PDA. It's a 26-item questionnaire, and it has a cutoff, a threshold, above which O'Nyans and her colleagues recommended that a child be assessed for PDA. So if children scored above that threshold, they would end up in the Autism EDA group, where even if they didn't have the diagnosis. If they did have the diagnosis of PDA, they'd be in the Autism and PDA group. I hope that makes sense. That's the most confusing bit of this presentation. We found that there were no differences in the type of provision or support that children in the three groups were receiving. So we asked questions about what sort of school the children went to, whether they had education, health and care plans or the old statements of special educational needs, whether they had a support assistant supporting them in the classroom. And we found that there were no differences in the type of provision or support that was being provided between the three groups. We also found that there were no differences in fixed term exclusions. So that's when children are excluded for a period of time from school, and that exclusion is recorded in the school records and on the child's record. There were no differences between the groups in fixed term exclusion. Where we did find group differences were in behaviours that challenge and in informal or sometimes called illegal exclusions. I found the informal exclusions finding really interesting. So parents of children and young people in the Autism PDA group, so that's children with a diagnosis of PDA, reported more informal exclusions. And an informal exclusion is where the school ring the parents and ask them to collect their child from school without the child being ill. So it's not illness as a reason, but they don't record that as a formal exclusion on the school records. It's actually illegal to do that. If schools are asking parents to collect their children for reasons other than illness, that should be recorded as a formal exclusion on the school records. So it was interesting and quite concerning to find that there's quite a lot of informal exclusions reported, particularly in the Autism PDA group. We also noticed differences in behaviours that challenge. So the Autism and PDA group displayed more behaviours that challenge than the other two groups. It kind of worked in a hierarchy, I suppose. The Autism and PDA group tended to display more behaviours that challenge, followed by the Autism EDA group, and then the Autism group. So that was the order in which they displayed behaviours that challenge. But interestingly, in two areas of behaviour, there were differences. So that was hurting staff or attempting to hurt staff, and hurting other pupils or attempting to hurt other pupils. On those behaviours alone, children in the Autism EDA group and children in the Autism group, there were no significant differences. So they were equally likely to display those behaviours. And children in the Autism PDA group were still more likely to display those behaviours. We also asked some open-ended questions, and one of those was, which professional has been the most supportive to you, and in what way did they provide that support? We had a lot of different responses to that question. Some of them, concerningly, some of the responses were that there was no professional that could be named that had provided support. So many parents and carers felt that they couldn't answer that question because there were no professionals that had provided adequate support. But of those that had, the most commonly reported professional was the professional that provided access to diagnosis. So that was the most helpful professional for many parents and carers. The second most common response was that it was a professional who had understood the child or young person and helped other people to understand them, who was the most helpful professional involved in their child's life. And the third most common response was that it was a professional that had provided practical strategies that had supported their child the most. But I think it's really important to note how many people said that actually there wasn't a single professional they could mention who had provided enough support. Another one of the qualitative questions we asked was a really open-ended one. It simply said, is there anything else you want to tell us about your child and their experience of education? And we got a lot of really valuable qualitative data from that question. And this was some of the things that parents and carers said. The first theme that we identified was being misunderstood. A lot of parents felt that their child had been misunderstood in the education system. And interestingly, for parents of children in the autism PDA group and the autism EDA group, they mentioned the fact that they felt that their child was misunderstood because they presented differently, maybe, compared to other autistic children. So you had parents explaining that the school had used strategies that were recommended for autistic children to improve their educational experience, but that those strategies had not been successful for their child or young person. We also heard from parents about masking, children masking their difficulties in school, and that made it difficult and had a negative impact on their mental well-being. We also heard about a lack of support, a lack of appropriate support available in school to support children and young people. We heard about anxiety, and many parents and carers reported that they felt that anxiety and subsequent mental health difficulties were caused by negative school experiences. And then we heard about flexibility, and these were some of the positive stories we heard in the qualitative results section, that some schools and teachers had been really flexible in the way that they engaged children and young people, and that was felt to be beneficial. So our conclusions. The first and perhaps a very concerning conclusion is that many autistic children are having a negative experience of school. Certainly the qualitative data really showed that many children were having a negative experience. There is some evidence that those experiences are more difficult for those with EDA behaviours, particularly in terms of the informal exclusions they experience and in terms of behaviours that challenge. And then that raised a question, which is, can differential diagnosis help professionals meet the distinct needs of individual autistic children? And that's something we're continuing to explore with an interview study. I think that's everything I've got to say, apart from to say thank you very much to Autistica. And if anyone has any questions, obviously there's the Q&A coming up, but those are my details as well on the screen if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Claire. Really, really interesting, and obviously a real shame to hear the difficulties that these children and the parents are facing to be understood. But I think, you know, really clearly coming through that need for individualised approaches, it just time and time again keeps coming up. So understanding those individual differences and adapting. So great, really, really interesting stuff. So we're just about to have our next speaker, and so that's Kim Craig, and going to be talking about understanding metacognitive abilities in autism. Hi, Kim.
Hello.
Hello. Do you want to try sharing your screen with us? Brilliant.
Yeah. Can everybody see my screen yet? Or
yeah, wonderful.
Great.
Want to go? Yeah, fantastic. All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you to everybody who's listening. I am a PhD student at Heriot-Watt University, and I'm interested in metacognition and autism. What is metacognition? It's a very difficult term to define, actually. It's generally thought of as thinking about thinking. It's your understanding of your own cognitive processes. A nice way to think about it is it's what you do before, during, and after a task, like the planning you do before you start a task, the monitoring and other metacognitive skills you do during, and then the evaluation of your performance that you might do after. A quick like basic example would be if you were reading a book and then you suddenly realize that you missed the last 2 paragraphs because your mind had been wandering. So you know you need to go back and read those last 2 paragraphs. That's an example of metacognitive monitoring. So as you can see, metacognitive skills seem to be associated with school and academics. And that is in fact the case. There is a great deal of evidence that metacognitive skills predict good academic achievement. And there is also a great deal of evidence that if you explicitly teach metacognitive skills to school-age children, that it improves their academic achievement. Also of note is that there are metacognitive-based therapies that improve symptoms of anxiety and depression. And recently, metacognition has been linked to, positively linked to social skills in autism. So that's why I'm really interested in metacognition in autism. There is research already, a great deal of research that looks at metacognition in autism. I shouldn't say a great deal because there's not. But the results so far are quite varied. Some research finds that metacognitive skills may be impaired in autistic participants when compared to non-autistic participants. Some research finds no group differences, and some research finds there are metacognitive skills that are actually enhanced in autistic participants versus non-autistic participants. So we felt the need, this research mostly uses one of 2 types of measures, either a meta-memory task or a self-report questionnaire. A meta-memory task is a judgment on your memory skills. A good example would be the feeling of knowing task. A feeling of knowing task presents pairs of words and asks participants to memorize as many as they can. Then they're presented with the first word in the pair and asked to recall the second word. If they can't recall the second word, this is where the metacognitive judgment comes in. They're asked, would they recognize the second word if they saw it in a list of words? So that feeling of knowing of, I would know the word if I saw it. That is a monitoring judgment, metacognitive monitoring. The problem with meta-memory tasks is they really only measure one metacognitive skill. The self-report questionnaire measures a wide variety of skills, but we're not very good at self-reporting on our metacognitive abilities. There's a great deal of research to show that what we say on a self-report questionnaire doesn't always match up with what we actually do. So we felt the need to come up with a task that would measure a broad range of metacognitive skills. And we wanted to make sure that the activity on the task was accessible to a broad range of ages and abilities. So what we did was we chose something that we know is a strength for autistic participants, and that is building puzzles. So what we asked the participants to do was predict how much time they felt they would need to build the 2 puzzles pictured. And we're getting 3 measures of planning here. One is the ability to gauge task difficulty. you can see that one puzzle is definitely more difficult than the other. So we're checking to see if participants recognize that. We're also getting the ability to properly, accurately allocate study time, meaning are we giving more time to the more difficult puzzle, and are we giving an accurate amount of time? Are we giving ourselves enough time to complete the puzzle? And then we're also just getting a general measure of planning time. And that goes from the start of this page until the first move of the first piece on the next page. And that's just the amount of time spent planning. So after they make this prediction, we then ask them to build the puzzles. They build both puzzles, and once finished with that, they get a feedback page which tells them exactly how much time they spent building each puzzle. Then they go to the next prediction page with 2 more puzzles. The assumption is that because of that feedback, if they're monitoring that feedback, they will then adjust their predictions on the next page to be a bit more accurate based on how they did previously and based on the difficulty level of the new puzzles. So that would be metacognitive monitoring and control. There are 10 sets of puzzles, and when they complete all the puzzles, we then ask them to evaluate how they did. There are 2 confidence judgments. One is how well they think they did predicting their times, and the other is how well they think they did building or completing the puzzles. The time prediction one, as I said before, is given feedback, but puzzles, there's no feedback at all. So that judgment is made without a yes, it was correct, or no, it wasn't. They don't know whether or not they were correct. We also ask participants to identify which strategies they used to help them complete the puzzles and what strategies might have helped them to have a better performance. So the puzzle task we used, or that we built, we used that as part of the battery of assessments. We included the feeling of knowing task that I described earlier, the Comega-Ming, which is a self-report of metacognitive skills. We also used something called the Strange Stories film task. It's a task where you watch videos and then you have to identify the theory of mind of the characters in the videos. And you also have to respond to one of the characters as if you were in that situation yourself. Along with those, we gave the autism spectrum quotient, the Ravens, which is a measure of IQ, and measures of depression and anxiety. We recruited 85 students, school-age children, ages 10 to 18. 51 of them were female. 15 of the students scored above the recommended cutoff on the AQ. What that cutoff says is if you score higher than the cutoff, you're likely to get an autism diagnosis. It's not definite, but there's a higher likelihood. The measures were given completely on Psychopy or Qualtrics, so all on the computer. And they were given in the same order. And the reason we gave them in the same order because we wanted to make sure there weren't too many challenging tasks next to each other. So that would end up with task fatigue, too many surveys next to each other. And we also wanted to make sure, since there were several metacognitive measures, that those weren't next to each other. So there was really one good order. And we gave these in 2 or 3 sessions, depending on the needs of the students and the school. So what did we find? Well, when we split the group by high levels of autistic traits, and that would be above the cutoff score, versus low levels of autistic traits, we found almost no group differences. There were no group differences in gauging task difficulty, on the feeling of knowing, or in self-reported metacognitive abilities. The only group difference was in planning time, and what we saw there was those with high levels of autistic traits use significantly more planning time than those with low levels of autistic traits. So then we wanted to check academic achievement and social skills. We had collected academic achievement from the schools that we worked with. So what we saw there was, yes, metacognitive skills do significantly and positively correlate with academic achievement, and metacognitive skills significantly correlate with social skills. Good social skills. And this was across the samples. This was the whole sample correlated to academic achievement and social skills. Interestingly, we found that the feeling of knowing, the metamemory judgment, did not significantly correlate with either academic skills or social skills, and that the judgment made without feedback, the judgment on how well you did on the puzzles, that also did not significantly correlate with academic achievement or social skills. But we wanted a little bit more information with that. We wanted to have a better idea of what this means for participants with high levels of autistic traits. So we did what's called moderation analysis. And these next two slides are really preliminary analysis. So we're just really starting to dig into what we're seeing. And what we found is that as levels of autistic traits increase, the relationship between your ability to accurately allocate study time and numeracy achievement increased. And this remained true even when we've controlled for age, IQ, depression, and anxiety. So in other words, those with high levels of autistic traits who also had good metacognitive skills tended to have better numeracy skills. We found the same thing with literacy, and we took a look also at social skills. And again, we found that as levels of autistic traits increase, the effect between the ability to accurately monitor and control your progress and the ability to respond in social situations increases. And again, this remains true even when controlling for age, IQ, depression, and anxiety. So just to give you a quick summary of the results, metacognitive skills are significantly and positively related to numeracy, literacy, and social skills in the sample that we had. Good metacognitive skills more strongly predict academic achievement and social skills at high levels of autistic traits. So what exactly does that mean? Well, given the amount of research that shows that teaching metacognitive skills improves academic achievement, these results do suggest that teaching metacognitive skills, explicitly teaching how to use the skills to school-age children with high levels of autistic traits, it may improve their academic achievement as well. Social skills, unfortunately, there's very little research about metacognition and its relationship to social skills. So this research suggests that we need to be taking a look at that relationship for all students. So really quickly, I just want to say a huge thank you to the schools who allowed me to conduct my research and to all the personnel who helped me out at each school. Thank you, huge thank you to all the participants and their parents. Thank you to my supervisors for helping me through my PhD research, and a quick special thank you to my autistic mentor who has massively helped guide my thinking throughout my research and helped my understanding of metacognition and autism. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kim. Really interesting. I didn't actually know what metacognition was before your talk, and I've learned an awful lot. It'd be really interesting to see if there is that link between metacognition and social skills as well. So yeah, watch this space. Great. So we can now go over to the Q&A. So I'm going to try and turn on videos for everyone that we've had so far. Or if you can turn it on yourselves, even better. Great. So we've got Cara, Claire, Jade, full house. So first of all, it'd be really nice to go around the virtual room and hear about how you got into research and autism specifically. So should we start off with Jade first?
Sure. Well, the short story is I did my degree in psychology. I did a PhD in numerical cognition and aging, but I'd always wanted to get into autism research. My brother is autistic, so I guess that's a factor too. And so I started 3 years ago now at Bath doing a postdoc in investigating how best to adapt communication in interviews for autistic people. And then I worked on this project now with Cara. That's me.
Great. And Cara, do you want to tell us a bit about your background?
Yes, so I don't actually have much of a research background. I kind of got involved with autistic children first. So I was working it was 2 different local CAM services. And I was involved with the diagnosis clinic and working one-to-one and thinking, especially from a clinical point of view, how we can adapt sort of CBT and one-to-one approaches for young people and children with autism. And then I saw this opportunity at the Uni of Bath, and I could just see how applicable it would be, and it sounded really good. So I went for it, and that's how I'm doing this project with Jade.
Fantastic. Claire, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a teacher by background, so I've taught in mainstream schools, but also in special needs schools and an autism specific school. And that was where I met some students who displayed extreme demand avoidance behaviours, and that was what inspired me to do my research in that area. And I also have an autistic brother, so that was how I got into that teaching in the first place.
Well, and Kim?
Same thing as Claire, actually. I'm a school teacher. I'm actually still teaching part-time. And I was just trying some things in my classroom to help my autistic students with literacy, understanding fiction and things like that, and saw some things and thought maybe I should see if there's more to this, and my supervisor encouraged me to do that, and I ended up here.
Fantastic. Gosh, you must be busy splitting your time between teaching and research. Great. So we've got quite a few questions that have come in on Q&A. So really sorry we won't be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we've chosen some that cover most bases. So Cara and Jade, I'm going to put these to both of you, and do you want to kind of tag team as to who wants to take them? So first question is this a programme of support that could be used in other universities? And if so, what barriers do you think there might be to universities sort of buying into it?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. Ideally, this study acts as a pilot trial, just to show that it's feasible and hopefully effective, and that other universities could take it on. I think obviously the barriers are always time and money and resources and space. But what we're kind of trying to suggest is that actually you can use the problem-solving structure and adapt it quite a lot for a lot of different teaching, and you can sort of incorporate it into personal tutor groups. So a lot of students meet in small student groups with their personal tutor now rather than individually. So you can incorporate it into that setting. So it could be kind of more meshed into the university sort of procedures that are already in place. And hopefully it's kind of quite resources light. But yeah, I think it should and could.
Great. Okay, we had another question. I think obviously there's a lot to deal with when you're going through that transition, and problem solving obviously being a useful skill, but also the sensory sort of overload of going into this new environment. Are there any plans to sort of look at adapting that physical environment to help students navigate university, or do you know of any research into that area, or do you think it could be valuable?
I think that's a really good question. It's not something we've dealt with in this study, but we have a researcher at Cara, Emma Collis, who herself is autistic, who's doing some research on exactly that. So on adapting university as a whole, including like lecture halls, that kind of thing, including the environment. I can post in the chat a link to that research project actually. So she's doing some research with both autistic students at Bath and autistic staff and other neurodiverse groups as well, to sort of address exactly that. So I'll find a link and post it.
Fantastic. I don't know if you want to take this one, Cara, but do you think that the findings are likely to translate across to employment, maybe to apprenticeship schemes and things like that?
In the respect of using that approach in apprenticeship?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the programme and the structure itself is really transferable, and I was looking on Twitter after we spoke, and people saying about actually I think it's really helpful for all of us, and I think we're all a bit guilty maybe sometimes of going with a quick fix that maybe doesn't last that long. And I do think that especially maybe in like a supervisory post, it's an approach you can take which is really methodical and logical. It would be interesting to see if it transferred across the kind of similar results, because it is another transition, and maybe having this formal approach to transitions in general would be helpful.
Yeah, we actually worked with Deutsche Bank on an autistic apprenticeship scheme. I don't know if any of you saw that, but and I don't think that approach was taken, but it could have been quite an interesting approach. Yeah, maybe something to think about in future.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, on to Claire. We've got a couple of questions for you here. So one of them is, did the EDA group also show significantly higher informal exclusions than the autism only group, or was it only the PDA group?
They showed slightly higher, but it wasn't statistically significant. So it was mainly the autism PDA group.
Great. And then the other one is just a bit visionary, really. So what can you see as the next steps you'd like to see through sort of research in that area?
Well, I'm doing an interview study to explore the educational experiences a little bit more. So that's what I'm doing. I think it would be interesting to find out some experiences of adults. There isn't a lot of research at all about adults with a PDA profile. So I think that would be a really interesting area of research to explore. I think those would be the main things. And also parents are feeding back that they'd like more research on practical strategies to support. That would be enough.
Oh, fantastic. Great. Sorry, we just lost you there, but I think, so you said practical strategies.
Yeah, practical strategy.
Fantastic. Okay. So over to Kim. So I think this is a parent here that said, I've thought my 12-year-old son might be masking at school. Given your evidence, is it possible he's actually using his metacognitive skills? This kind of knowledge could really help parents gauge risk of potential mental health problems.
It is possible. I was actually just watching another series of videos the other day where autistic participants were talking about how masking they actually felt was somewhat of a good thing. Some definitely don't feel that way, but some do feel that way. And it is possible. You just have to figure out whether or not your child realizes he's masking, and that would be the metacognitive piece. So then, yeah, it would be metacognitive skills, and they're doing it for a specific reason, but then also they need to understand why they're doing it and whether or not that's a good metacognitive choice.
Yeah. And I guess coming back to that communication between school and parents, what's going on in each environment, and a level of trust there. And yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
Great. And does metacognition sort of come under the umbrella of executive functioning skills? Someone's asked.
Yeah, I actually just typed the answer to that. No.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Well done.
They're very different. Well, I shouldn't say they're very different. They're related, but they are two different things. It's often they get confused. And the study that I mentioned in my research about finding that metacognitive skills were more related to social skills, that was over executive functioning skills. So in autism, metacognition is more related to social skills than executive functioning skills. So.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, I think we've covered off most of the questions here. Let me just see if there's any others. I think I've got some very long ones here. So,
Rebecca, there was one about my research and Jade and Clare. Yeah,
brilliant.
Jade.
If you've spotted one, I'm just sifting through. So yeah, go for it. Do you want to answer that one? Do you want to read out the question to start with?
Sure. They asked if metacognition, if that improves metacognition. Yeah, metacognition and problem-solving skills are highly, highly associated. So, and you're almost doing think-alouds with having everybody throw out ideas, and that's a metacognitive strategy. It's brilliant. So yeah, you're teaching metacognitive skills through your program.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Right, I think that a lot of the other questions here are sort of comments on bits and pieces as well, which is great. We do have one in here that's come in. I think this is more of a comment. Yeah, just back to Claire saying, great to hear that you're planning on expanding this work and through interviews. Would love to see your research takes you and definitely the practical side. So do keep us in the loop with all of your research, and if you're recruiting anyone for studies, we have the Discover Network, so we can reach out to autistic people and family members to get people for your study. And if we've got anyone sort of on the attending the session today. If you're not a member of Discover, do join Discover. It's your way to hear about the latest studies, so research that's coming out of those studies, but also opportunities to get involved. So we send you personalised emails based on sort of what group you fall into. So so you can join up. Yeah, someone's put a link in there. Brilliant. They got the hint. So join Discover. It's free, and yeah, as I say, you can join up and then tell us your preferences in terms of how you'd like to hear from us. So I think we're a few minutes early, like 5 minutes early for our break, but I think that means everyone can have a little bit of a longer break. And then we're going to be back at 11:30, or a minute before maybe, for Anne Emerson, who's going to be talking about theorising school-related anxiety in autistic adolescents. But just for now, I just want to say thank you, Kim, thank you, Claire, thank you, Cara, and thank you, Jade. Really, really interesting. And yeah, any other final sort of questions or comments we have, we'll pass on to you from the attendees. Thanks. And you guys can turn off your cameras now and go and have a well-earned cup of coffee.